All you gotta do is drink lots of beer and make sure all the bathrooms are locked. Alrighty. Well, tonight we've got a really special one in the fact that we don't have just one speaker. We've got several speakers, and we're highlighting something that until recently, the last 30 years, hasn't really been highlighted. You know, in the 70s, a lot of clubs finally opened up and had women in the club. Here in the 80s, we opened up here in the Westerners, and look at this, half the audience is women. And a lot of history has only been written by men, so there's not as many women that's highlighted in our histories. And today we're going to try to highlight a few that are local, you may have heard of, may not have heard of. So that's our kind of our theme as we're getting started here. And you want me, you introduce them, or me introduce them? If you're going to have me introduce them, I need the list.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, how about I do it?
How about what?
You're doing great.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Sarah.
Can you help us with technical?
Technicals.
Yeah.
Sure.
We're going to let Vic do the technical. Okay. So we have 5 speakers tonight that have come together to talk about different women of this area. And, oops, I changed my page. Erica DC, who's going to talk to us about Sister Bilkis. Anyone ever hear of Sister Bilkis?
Only from the top of her book.
Fascinating story. You're going to love it. Jeff Sims is going to speak about a person yet unnamed. He changed his person, so I can't tell you. Oh, it's a mystery woman. Susan Walker, who is dressed in an official jail uniform from the 1800s. Matron's outfit from the jail is speaking about the matron, the first matron of the jails in the area. Dick is going to speak about Sister Joseph that started the Sacred Heart Hospital. And I am dressed like a deaconess missionary trainee, in case you wondered. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about deaconesses, how they started a nursing school in a hospital in the area, and then I'm going to tell you about a very special deaconess who went through the nursing program and made quite an impact in our city. So, with that...
And with that, we'll get going here. So our first speaker is one we have had as a speaker before. And it's going to be a delight to hear her with a continuation, in a way, of her subject. But this is a lady that's an author and going to be well known in circles of history. And here is Erica DC. Did I pronounce it? DC? DC. DC. Like DC. Okay. Like DC. Okay, so here is Erica. Erica is going to be in her chair, so I'll hand her the microphone, and she's going to give me directions of when to turn the computer on for her. And this is truly a case she's going to tell me where to go.
I'm just going to read. Now hopefully everybody can hear me. All right. Just jump right in. In 1908, a new chapter in Spokane's history unfolded with the arrival of the Industrial Workers of the World, otherwise known as IWW, or commonly known as Wobblies. Determined to combat the exploitation of laborers by dishonest employment agencies, they took to Stephen Street, holding open-air meetings at the very doorsteps of these agencies to reach vulnerable workers. Concerned that these gatherings disrupted Spokane's business environment, the City Council took action, passing an ordinance that banned public speaking and the distribution of literature within the downtown business district. Mayor Nelson Pratt raised no objections, and the law took effect on January 1st, 1909, setting the stage for the infamous Spokane free speech fight. Sister Flora Bilkis, known as the churchless evangelist and sometimes dubbed Spokane's Carrie Nation by the press, was a dedicated mission worker and street preacher. She could often be found preaching near her mission in the Trent Alley, across from Yokohama Hand Laundry. However, she found herself competing with the IWW for space on Stevens Street, where she continued her sermons even after the city's public speaking ordinance took effect. Believing the law's exemption for religious organizations like the Salvation Army and Volunteers of America applied to her, Sister Bilkis defied the ban. Meanwhile, the Wobblies, viewing the ordinance as a direct attack on their right to organize and advocate for exploited workers, launched a mass civil disobedience campaign. Members flooded into Spokane from across the country, deliberately violating the law in protest. As tensions escalated between the city and the IWW, Sister Bilkis found herself caught in the turmoil. Struggling to hold an audience from her soapbox, she faced increasingly aggressive police enforcement. Eventually, officers began arresting her as well. Each time she was taken in, she demanded to speak with Police Chief Bren Rice. Frustrated by her persistence, Rice finally had her escorted from his office after she declared, "I will obey God rather than man." In 1909, Acting Police Chief John Sullivan expanded the city's public speaking ordinance to include street evangelists and slum workers, effectively silencing Sister Flora Bilkis. Undetoured, she found a creative way to continue her sermons. Forbidden from preaching on the street, she climbed onto the rooftop. There it is. Onto the rooftop of her mission behind the Hotel Coeur d'Alene and delivered her message to the curious onlookers gathered in the alley below. Quoting Matthew 10:27, she proclaimed, "And ye hear in the ear that ye preach upon the housetops." Yes. On the morning of May 14, 1910, Sister Bilkis awoke with a strong desire to take to the streets of Spokane and expose the deplorable conditions of the city jail. At 9:30 a.m., she arrived on Riverside Avenue, draped in an American flag, Bible in hand, ready to address passers-by. Her striking attire and Mississippi drawl booming from her megaphone quickly drew the attention of Officer Henry Fredericks, who arrested her. Standing her ground and refusing to walk to the police station, she requested to be transported in the Black Maria, the police wagon. Instead, the officer hailed a taxi cab, put her inside to deliver her to the jail, while the crowd that had gathered cheered on. As the cab pulled away, she leaned out the window, tears in her eyes, and called out to the onlookers, "Goodbye, dears, I'm going to leave you now." At the police station, Sister Bilkis was met by Spokane Mayor Nelson Pratt and Acting Chief Sullivan. In a private conference, she explained her calling to preach that morning. After being interviewed, she was released on her own recognizance, pending a court hearing. Next one, yes, please. In the courtroom of Justice Samuel Mann.
She has another picture.
Okay, it's all right.
We got lost.
That's all right. There she is.
The murmuring gallery that came to witness Sister Bilkis' hearing fell silent as the door swung open and Sister Bilkis entered, with an American flag fashioned as a bodice draping over her left shoulder, then cascading down her skirt, secured with a Carrie Nation hatchet pin. Her Bible, as always, was in her hand. She sat down confidently, ready to defend herself. "The Lord told me to speak on Riverside, and so I went," she declared before launching into a long diatribe. Justice Mann attempted several times to interject, but she repeatedly cut him off, first accusing the City Council of corruption, only to be reminded that the hearing was not about the City Council. She was then She then pointed out to the justice that he was a Mason, as was her father and late husband, insisting that he was therefore pledged to protect her. Flustered, Justice Mann ordered a 10-day continuance, inviting her to discuss the ordinance privately in his office. Delighted, she responded, "I won't have to go on bread and water after all." With that, she traipsed out of the courtroom, her flag trailing behind her. From that point on, she continued preaching on the streets undisturbed. Exhausted by her relentless defiance, the police, the chief, and the justice ultimately just let her be. The Spokane's free speech battle entered into its second year. The city council finally relented. On June 25, 1910, after relentless pressure from the IWW and the theatrical persistence of Sister Bilkis, the council amended the ordinance, directing the Board of Police Commissioners to issue permits for public speaking and literature distribution downtown. The first person in line to receive a permit, Sister Bilkis. Right behind her stood IWW Secretary Charlie L. Filligno. While it was notoriously a hard-fought victory for the IWW, it was a shared triumph with the unrecognized, fearless one-woman army who had challenged the ordinance to ensure that everybody had the right to free speech on Spokane's streets.
Thank you for telling us about Sister Bilkis. Wow, what bravery. Mr. Sims, would you like to tell us about the mystery? Women, don't look away. Would you like to come forward, or would you like me to bring you the mic? Okay. Everyone, please welcome our next guest speaker talking about infamous and famous women, Mr. Jeff Sims.
Yeah, I was going to talk about Irish hate, but after I found out all these heroic women of dignity and purpose that were going to be spoken about tonight, I thought, well, I think I better find somebody a little more decent instead of somebody who may or may not have burned down.
Tell us who Irish Kate is, for those that don't know.
I'm sorry?
Who is she?
She may or may not have burned down Spokane in 1889. I think she did, but... Anywho, so last night I got shamed into changing my mind and finding something a little more dignified. About a block and a half from where I live, there's a really cool house. It's obviously built by a craftsman, and I've driven by it, walked by it tons over the last 20, 25 years, and I always wondered about it. So several years ago I looked into it, and I found out that that house was built by a very exceptional woman in 1933. Her name was... Her real name was Rhoda Catherine Cass. She was born in the hills of Virginia in 1883, moved with her family to Kentucky when she was 5 years old, lost her mother not long after, and she was raised by her paternal aunt, who apparently was a very strong woman herself. Rose, as she was called, her real name was Rose, everyone called her Rose. She married in 1901 at the age of 18. Before that, she attended Berea College in Kentucky, but after she married, she stopped going to college, and her paternal aunt said, no, go back to college. So she was married and still had 2 kids and stuck it out until she graduated. She is quoted as saying, "I finished up the hard way. I came home at night exhausted to my husband and 2 little ones. I didn't want to disappoint my mother. I stayed with it until I graduated." She eventually had 5 children who were born between 1901 and 1909. One of the daughters died young at the age of 10 in 1918, and her son Carl was killed in a car crash in 1928 at age 16. So she had a hard life. She was divorced she divorced Mr. Hearst about 1912 and came out to Washington. A little after that, came to Spokane in 1917, and here she married George Steinball, who was 9 years her junior. But, you know, with 5 kids, you need somebody to help with that. Anyway, he was an Army veteran and worked for the GN Railroad, and they also had a farm, a ranch out at Four Elms. The husband sued her for divorce in 1924 on the grounds that she heaped indignity upon him by forcing him to cook part of his own meals. He also claimed that she threatened him with a butcher knife and threw a percolator at him, which she denied. The judge said, "Work it out." In 1927, Steinbau left her and she sued on the grounds of abandonment. And she went out to Four Elms and repossessed the livestock in the car and moved into town and built the house in 1933. It's on Market Street, about halfway between Francis and Lincoln Street. She was an artist, author, gardener, farmer, rancher. She founded and headed up the Morgan Acres Garden Club, and which was also responsible for putting up the monument on Palmer Road for the original St. Michael's Mission. And that monument is still there. She was very active in civic affairs. She started going to the Priestlake country in the early 1920s for business and pleasure. And eventually she bought a 640-acre ranch at Nordman from the original homesteader, a Swede named Nordman. And she ran the ranch by herself. She raised Black Angus cattle, brought the cattle into town by herself to sell. She moved back and forth between Nordman and Spokane before she finally moved out to Nordman in the 40s. She lived in a log cabin built by the original homesteader. Had a very large garden. Oh, I failed to mention the house on Market Street, which is still there. It's a really cool house. She built that all with recycled and resalvaged materials, bit by bit, designed it herself, built it herself. She had a very extensive garden in the back, and she had garden parties there, and the garden is still there. The lady that owns the house now maintains the garden. It's a really cool garden. She has a massage business, I believe. Anyway, she moved out to Nordman, ran the ranch by herself, and she was quoted as saying, "It takes courage to be a woman out here." You know, she died in 1974 at age 91 and is buried at the Newport Cemetery. She's a cool lady.
Could you say her name one more time?
Rose
Rose Hurst. Rose Hurst. Hurst. Thank you so much. What an interesting person. Thank you for that research. Well, when you figure that the world's 50% women, there's all kinds of stories out there that we never get to hear. And Dick told you, I don't think I've told all of you, but maybe I have. In 1989, I was asked to come speak to a group called the Westerners. I was working for a Medical Service Corporation of Eastern Washington, and I was 29 or 30, and I was giving a speech on the 65-year history of insurance, which is really a interesting topic. And then I walked into Casey's, this smoke-filled room with all these men, and they all stopped and looked at me, and one of them said, "I'll take another, are you the cocktail waitress?" And I said, "Oh, no, I'm your speaker." They all looked at each other and said, "No, this is an all men's group." And I said, "Well, I think I'm your speaker. Can I still be your speaker?" And they all had to have a big talk about it. But I did end up giving my little talk. They allowed me to do that, but it was kind of an odd situation for all of them. And so then, much to my delight, later when it became co-ed, I actually joined Westerners, and that's my Westerners women's story. And with that, I'd like to introduce the matron that's amongst us, and the jail matron, who you heard Sister Bilkis talk about the terrible circumstances that were going on in the very corrupt jail at the time. The Women's Club was also a part of bringing about change and protecting the women that ended up in that jail. And dressed in her appropriate uniform, Sue is going to talk to us a little bit about the matrons, the women matrons of the jails.
Well, thank you, Erica, because Sister Bilkis, well, I knew I'd get that wrong. I mean, Mary Seymour was right there and with her. I mean, it's crazy. So, I will pass this around, but so when we found out about Mary Seymour, I actually found her headstone out at Greenwood behind where the White House office used to be, and it's one of our historical monuments that we did in 2012. And so it has a flag marker on there if you guys drive out there to see it. But reading her story, she just absolutely fascinated me. And I'm going to pass these around for you guys to look at. I'll start with Dick. That picture is a 1912 picture of the Spokane Police Department in a building that was, I don't know whether Romanesque is the right word for the architecture, but it was a magnificent building. And in my research writing our Life Behind the Badge books, I learned in reading the minutes of the city council that they argued and argued and argued and argued over where they were going to put that building. And when they built it, and it was built kind of where the merry-go-round is now, the carousel, and it was in the red light district at the time. And by 1918, they had to tear that beautiful building down because the railroads came through. So the lesson should be, if you have to argue and argue, go back to the drawing board and start over. Because if it would have been put in another place, we might still have that beautiful building. And you can see a part of it in this picture. I asked Tony Bamonte why, that's one of my favorite pictures, why there were so many policemen. And there's a picture of the first 3 matrons in Spokane, and I'll get to that in a minute, but Tony had told me that the population of the city of Spokane tripled in size between 1900 and 1910. So that's why there's so many policemen. Now in this picture, you're going to see I've got an arrow pointed to Mary Seymour, and then there's also an arrow pointed to William H. Lewis, and you each have probably a book about William H. Lewis. And little did Dick know until tonight that his grandson, Bill Lewis, will be our speaker in May. So yeah, I'm really excited about that because I know this kid. Anyway, when we dedicated this monument, I just thought, how can we pay tribute to her? And I have a neighbor who can make anything without a pattern. And she made a replica of her uniform, which is this uniform, from that picture that you see of her. And I wore it as the MC when we dedicated that historical monument. 65 members of her family showed up. And it meant so much to them to see me in uniform, and I had no idea it would have that effect. But between the Westerners and Maggie, you guys have brought out something in myself I didn't know existed. I mean, being a saloon girl and now a matron? What's this world coming to? But Mary Seymour planted seeds, and I'll explain it to you, but I want to give a little bit of her history. So Mary Carolyn Davidson Seymour was born in Boone County, Indiana on August 15, 1855, the first of 6 children born to James and Julia Buttry Davidson. Her childhood was spent in Chester, Nebraska. Although Mary had many health challenges throughout her life, she still accomplished an amazing amount in her 78 years. Holy cow. That's as old as I am. I didn't realize that. Anyway, in 1888, Mary was living in Newcastle, Wyoming with her husband, Martin Osborne, and 3 children, James Muller, Arthur Edward, and Bonnie Bell. Now remember that name, Bonnie Bell. A 4th child, Julia, had died in infancy. Martin, who was a brakeman for the railroad, died from a train coupling accident. Mary and her children moved to Spokane in 1891. Where she worked as a waitress at the Rockaway Cafe. She and the children lived in rented rooms in downtown Spokane. In 1893, Mary married Clint Hardesty. It was the year of the economic panic of 1893, and the family subsisted on scraps from the restaurant. Over the years, Mary's jobs consisted of cooking for field crews, waitressing, taking care of the sick, while supplementing her income by taking in boarders. In 1896, the Volunteers of America, an offshoot of the Salvation Army, was organized. Mary, who wanted to be a missionary, became deeply involved shortly after and was very proud to be a part of this American Army. On September 7th, 1905, her second husband, Clinton Hardesty, died of tuberculosis. Later the next year, she married Reverend William Seymour, member of the United Brethren. Now, I'm going to stick this in. I don't think it's alluded to in the rest of it, but this was a time when the women would come speaking, the suffragettes, we call them. They would come to speak on behalf of the women's right to vote and women's rights, which is what Erica alluded to. And there was one of them, and I can't think, it could have been Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, maybe. I don't know, I can't remember. But one of them got arrested and thrown into jail. And it was just men that were jailers at the time. And she was so appalled by the condition of the jail that she rallied for matrons. And because of what she did, and I'll get into the rest of the story, but that's how she ended up being a matron, but we'll get into that here. During this time, the city was recognizing the need to have women working in the jails, but the idea was hotly contested. Finally, a law was passed on February 20th, 1893, requiring the appointment of police matrons. At first, the women of the Salvation Army took care of the duties that should be performed by a matron. The first jail matron, appointed in January 1902, was a member of the Salvation Army Home who acted officially without pay. On June 1st, 1910, an ordinance creating the position for 3 jail matrons was passed. The matrons were restricted to the city jail, but that's the picture with those first 3 matrons that I'm passing around. They were sworn in as officers, wore uniforms and stars, and had limited authority to make arrests. Activities of the matrons were confined to the jail. It was hailed as the greatest victory for decency ever attained in Spokane. Excuse me. And was celebrated by those who had worked for nearly 2 decades to reach this goal. Mary was one of the first to apply when the department announced it would be hiring women for work as jail matrons in the city jail. Excuse me, here I go again. On August 29th, 1910, Mary joined the police department. Mary was 55 years old when she began, and the job was not easy. It amazed many that this diminutive 5' 1" lady could hold such authority and earn the respect of both the inmates and the members of the department. She became known to all as Mother Seymour. Often Mary brought inmates to her home to teach them through the domestic skills. Mary was very good at keeping a watchful eye on the inmates and cared deeply about for talking so much. I think I'm okay. You're a sweetheart. I should have brought my water up with me. Anyway, her daughter was so impressed by her mother's missionary heart that let's see, is that the rest of it? I may be repeating myself here. Anyway, Mary retired on January 16th, 1932 at the age of 77, having been a public servant for 22 years. She died a year later, on September 2nd, 1933. Her funeral procession was accompanied by police patrol vehicles and was the first to have a motorcycle escort from the city center to Greenwood Memorial Terrace. The pallbearers were police officers and detectives. As a sign of respect for her service, the department allowed a badge paid for by fellow employees to be inlaid on her grave marker. Many years later, Mary's daughter, Bonnie Bell Osborne Martin, influenced by her mother's years of her service and her missionary heart, pioneered the Pacific Coast Mission, Spokane's homeless shelter. In 1951, it became the Union Gospel Mission. Her work was a legacy to the example and teaching of her mother, Mary Davidson Seymour. This makes me cry. Anyway, we had the Phil Altmeyer at the monument dedication, and he got up and spoke. And I just think that you think about this woman. I mean, she had a rough life, but she cared, and the women spoke out about the horrible conditions of the jail. They got the matrons. It made a heck of a lot of difference in a lot of life. But remember, this one saying, one person can make a difference, and look what that one person did. So it's an honor to honor her memory. Thank you.
Sue, what was her last name again?
Bonnie Bell what?
Oh, Bonnie Bell Martin.
There we go.
M-A-R-T-I-N.
Want to go next?
Sure.
Okay. So Dick will be introducing himself.
Okay, thank you. I've got a little bit to add to Maggie's story about Westerners. You know, this club did start strictly as a male club. And I did a talk on this, we're at the 65th anniversary of this club, about the history. And some of you may remember this, that when it started, and I don't have my notes in front of me, but it was either the deputy sheriff or the sheriff wanted to have a Christmas party after they had started, and he wanted to bring his wife. And the person that was one or the other said, no way, no women, period, for any function, period. And the deputy sheriff or sheriff, whichever he was, quit if it was going to be that stringent on women. Later, that man that was so arduous about no women, it is said that when he died, he bought 2 plots so a woman could not be buried next to him. So that's our start as a club. And you, at 30, at 8, 7, 50 years later, you still are experiencing it. So, yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to share a lady that should be well known in this town, and some of you may be well known, and that is Mother Joseph. You may have heard her name before. How many have heard her name before, Mother Joseph? Half of you know it. Well, maybe it may not be any new information for you, but it'll be a fun story anyway. So, you know, Father Cataldo started Gonzaga, and he initially wanted that to be an Indian school, and he got outvoted. Well, there's another priest that also wanted to start an Indian school here, and in order to do that, he wrote a letter back to Montreal and asked some nuns to come out here and start an Indian school. And Mother Joseph and some other nuns heeded the call. Now, at this time in our history, how did they get here? They got on a ship. They went down the eastern starboard, around South America, and they landed in Chile. And in Chile, a couple of nuns saw a need for an orphanage and got off the ship and started an orphanage there. The ship came up to Columbia River. She changed ships, came up the Columbia River to the Walla Walla River, got on a wagon and came to Spokane. While she's here, the ghost strikes are happening over there in the Ponderay, or not Ponderay, Coeur d'Alene mining district. So, her and 2 nuns and a man go by horseback over to the Coeur d'Alenes, and this is the words the book says. She begged. Begged for food, and she begged for money. She wanted to build a hospital. There's no hospital between Seattle and Minneapolis. But this hospital is going to be 100 miles where they work. It's going to be in Spokane. And they're working in the Coeur d'Alene mining district. But she's got a lot of drive, a lot of determination, and she gets money to build a hospital in Spokane. Then she puts on a different hat. She becomes an architect and designs a 100-bed hospital. And then she puts on another different hat and becomes the builder of that hospital. If you walk the river walk, behind the convention center, between the convention center and now the Doubletree, there's a monument to Mother Joseph. She has a trowel in one hand and a brick in the other, and there's a small brick wall being built in front of her, and she is building that brick wall, and there's a man bringing a wheelbarrow full of bricks to her. Well, once she got this created, she went on to build another hospital in Vancouver, Washington, and another hospital in Wallace, Idaho. 3 hospitals she personally funded designed and created. And that was built, ours was here in Spokane, was built along the river. And then because of the railroad coming through, it had to move, and it got moved up to where it is currently. And the Sacred Heart Hospital Complex now is 80 hospitals strong across the West. You've really got to tip your hat to Mother Joseph, the builder of 3 hospitals. Wow, what a drive that she had. Yeah. And later, Sister Peter Cleaver is a very dynamic leader of Sacred Heart, another woman. We don't have the story about her tonight, but another very, very dynamic woman of the Sacred Heart complex. So that's my story. And since Maggie's going to tell about another religious started hospital here, I'll share a joke to introduce her. So there's 4 Protestant ministers sitting around having coffee. And one of them says to the other, my goodness, why is it that the Catholic Church is so large? You know, it's one of the largest churches in the entire world. How did it ever get that way? And one says, well, maybe it's because they do the rosary. Another one says, well, maybe it's because they pray to St. Anthony. And the third one says, well, maybe it's because they have a pope. And the fourth one says, well, maybe it's because they have confessions. And you know, confessions could be something kind of fun. Why don't the 4 of us sit around and we'll do confessions and see how it feels? I'll go first, he says. First one says, well, you know, when I'm by myself, and I know I'm going to be by myself for a while, I love to drink. I can finish a whole bottle of whiskey in one night. The second one says, well, I've got a gambling problem. I've even stolen money from the collection plate. The third one says, well, you know, sometimes I lust after women even when my wife's there. And the fourth one hesitates. And the 3 look at that fourth Protestant minister and says, hey, wait a minute. We've just disclosed our confession. You've got to disclose yours. And he says, well, I love to gossip and I can't wait till I get out of here. So, with that as a transition, here is Maggie telling us about the Deaconess Hospitals. And it's another religious hospital. And by the way, in Great Falls, they got the same 2 major hospitals, Sacred Heart and Deaconess. Here's Maggie.
Okay. Well, hello. Who's going to get my technical expert over here is going to get my slides up, and we're going to tell you a little bit more about this. This is kind of a group person talk. And the reason why is that there are so many people along the way that it's just going to be a quick synopsis of what it looked like in Spokane at that time period. And you've already heard that men and women did a lot of things separately. You've already heard about the missionary movement that was happening throughout all kinds of religions. If you weren't a specific religion, you might be a Volunteers of America. You might be a nun if you joined the Catholic Church. But along with that missionary, it all came kind of they said post-Civil War. It was really when women started, the suffrage movement was starting, and really the socially acceptable thing to do was be a missionary of some kind. So every missionary and every group had some form of a missionary system. So we were really not all that different. And what you're seeing on me today is kind of a fake missionary trainee outfit from the area, although this hat is actually an original hat from the missionary program here at Deaconess. And so we'll get my slides up, I think. No, that's fine. So the Deaconess Association, actually, deaconesses, I'm sure you've heard of them, they're in the Bible. They were women missionaries, and they're actually mentioned as far back as the Bible. And that's where the idea came from. And of course, as you know, sometimes they got written out of the Bible and then they got put back in. But somewhere in around the 1800s, post-Civil War, the missionary movement, the deaconess missionary movement in particular, started taking hold in the United States. It was all over the world. But these were women that wanted to be missionaries, but didn't necessarily want to marry Christ for life. So when you became a deaconess missionary, you didn't have to do that. But the Deaconess Association itself started, and it started with schools in Chicago and New York, and then they started training women to be deaconesses. Now, when you became a deaconess, you didn't necessarily become a nurse. The first thing you learned how to do was pray. You learned how to be temperate and modest. Now, I did get comments from the back that maybe that wasn't why I was never a deaconess. But I don't know. I thought it was a good idea. But the deaconesses took this on, and you could take it on for as long as you wanted. And then you could rescind your missionary status, and you could get married and move on in life. And so the Deaconess Association looked very tempting to a lot of women who wanted to do something besides get married and have children and live a life that way and serve others. And so this became popular in Methodists, it became popular with Presbyterians, and it became popular with Lutherans. And so this wasn't just primarily Methodist. But here in Spokane, we had a little competition going on between the Catholics and the Methodists. And so if you didn't know that, those were the two largest churches of the time in the 1880s. And so the Central United Methodist Church, which happened to be down on the corner of 3rd and Howard, the building is still there, put 2 deaconesses from the Deaconess Association in the 2-story apartment building across from it. And they were the missionaries. Now, if you want to know where the corner that is, it's McDonald's. So if you can picture McDonald's on 3rd and Howard, that's where the first 2 deaconesses lived. And they were on the 2nd floor, and their job was primarily to provide missionary work and the good word, and to get you, they did social work. They talked to you about how not to spoil your milk and how to not get food illness, and not get, and they would nurse you and pray a lot through infection because there was no such thing as antibiotics. So we can move on to the next slide, please. So this is who deaconesses were. Missionaries, and date back to the Bible. I've said a little bit of this. This was the minister of spiritual and physical needs, and we'll go on to the next slide. And what did they do? They did a wide variety of social work. They worked with the poor, the widowed, the orphan, immigrants, healthcare, and education, and they organized and carried social work. Okay, next slide. And so this is an example. The deaconesses that were here, as I said, 2 of them started from the Deaconess Association established with the Central United Methodist Church. This happens to be an early photograph of Wallace, Idaho, because they were also over in Idaho. They were also serving people in eastern Washington. Anywhere you had a Methodist church or outcropping or Presbyterian church, deaconesses were sent there to do the mission work. Next slide. And that included the African Episcopal Church, and they also had their own. Now, culturally, we were not only divided by men and women, we were also divided by race. But the African American Episcopal Church also had their own association of deaconesses, and we had several African American deaconesses in the area that served the African American Episcopal Church in the area. Next slide. So here were the requirements. You needed religious education. During the time that you were serving, you could not be married. You had to be sober. They were a temperance society, and you served where you were sent. Next slide. In this area, we had a missionary site at the United Methodist Church, as I told you, and what happened next was that a stranger came to town. As you know, there were lots of miners, there were lots of lumbermen, there were lots of people that came to town for supplies. They had a sick man who was not able to be treated anywhere else. He came with a terrible stomachache. He came to the 2 missionary women, They said he was very ill and they didn't know what to do with him. So they went and they called the doctor from the Central United Methodist Church. They found Dr. Libby and asked him to come over. He decided that this man needed an appendectomy, so they cleared the breakfast table, boiled some water, and gave him an appendectomy in the mission. And that's when they decided, maybe we need a hospital for all the people that aren't Catholics in town or aren't getting health care in other places. Next slide. He even brought us a nightgown from his own stock. And the man left town without paying a bill. So that's when free medical care started. And we all know how that works. Well, along that line, that story got back to the church. And we had mining, faith, promises, and mamas. And Franklin Pierce O'Neill brought his wife to Spokane. And Minnie Beard O'Neill was very homesick. And she prayed and decided that we needed a hospital in this area. And she prayed that her husband would go up to British Columbia and he would strike it in a mine, and if he did that, she would start the hospital. And sure enough, he struck a mine, he got $50,000 for his mine, and they gave $5,000, and then they took the property that they owned, dismantled the building they had on it, repurposed all of the materials in it, and built their hospital, the first one at 715 East 4th Avenue. Next slide. And she named it after her mama. The homesick girl named it the Maria Beard Home and Hospital. This was a 20-room, 2.5-story building. It was half for elder care, and it was half for hospital beds. And next slide. But now we need people to take care of the people in those hospitals. And Miss Richards was hired to be the first hospital superintendent. And this is an official deaconess look. That's the proper deaconess hat she has on with the big bow tie. And they wore those clear up until the 1980s. She was the first superintendent of the hospital and elder home till 1904. Next slide. And from that, they realized they needed more people to know how to do this. So they started their own school of nursing. And that was started in 1889. The hospital the first building was started in 1897. They started this in 1889. These people graduated in 1901, the first 4 members. And if you'll look at their hats, this is their hat. Then they got a little black stripe around it when they graduated, and that showed they were graduate nurses. Now these nurses worked 6 12-hour days, 6 days a week with 4 hours off on Sundays, and they were expected to go to their church. And in addition, these were not deaconesses, these were nurses. So in addition to the deaconesses that were serving every church in the area, you also had nurses. And the nurses' job, they committed to remaining unmarried, working 6 days, 12 hours a day, and then taking their 4 hours off every Sunday to go to church. And then they were sent back to the hospital if there were any chores that needed to be done to get them finished up for the rest of the week. There were 2 other hospitals in the area by then, St. Luke's and Sacred Heart, and the town was booming because it was a booming mill in Minetown, and they continued to grow, and they ended up building newer, larger facilities in 1907, 1919, and 1923. And as the hospital grew, the unmarried nurses all continued to grow. There's a really poignant story that was written about one of the nurses in 1918, because the unmarried nurses lived in the hospital. But in 1918, there was a story that I was able to read from a woman who sent back a letter that had been written to her best friend. And the best friend's family sent the letter back from this brand new nurse, where she described her excitement of being a brand new nurse and a brand new nursing student at Deaconess. She described how the first thing she did was sew her garments and what she was going to wear to the event, and how they slept in the attic. Then she went on to explain that there were people getting sick and that she had caught the bug, and so they had her up in the attic getting better. And she went on to explain in a next day's letter a little more about not feeling well. And 2 days later, this woman died of the Spanish flu. And it was the beginning of the Spanish flu epidemic in the Spokane area. and it had absolutely ripped through the town. And that was how they treated it. These women, when they were trained, had to walk from down on 4th Avenue up to 29th and Grand every single day to prove that they were strong enough to do the job. They had to carry buckets of poo and pee down the steps and up the steps in the 2-story buildings. They had to have the strength to do that and the strength to carry the patients up and down the steps as well. They were expected to help keep the maggots alive that they used in the wound care. They had a number, and they had to roll bandages. Those were just some of the side jobs that they did at that time. So it gives you kind of a picture of what all these nurses were expected to do. So along that line, the nurses began in 1901. You can go to the next slide, and they continued to grow and grow and grow until we had an average of 100 to 200 patients a month, and they charged $1 a day. Dick, next slide, thanks. So that brings us to a particular nurse that went through the nursing school, and that happens to be Anna Mae Erickson. I just kind of brought you along to all of this. And if none of you have heard of Anna Mae Erickson, she was one of the students of Deaconess School of Nursing. She went through the School of Nursing in 1943, and then she went off to war, and she became an Army Air Corps nurse and a Red Cross nurse, and served in World War II. She was a bronze medaled hero in World War II for the work that she did as an Army Air Corps nurse. And in 1947, she returned to Deaconess Medical Center, where she started her nursing career as a civilian. Next slide. And now we're going to talk about Anna Mae and some of the amazing things she did. Although Anna Mae Erickson was never a deaconess, she was raised and instilled with the deaconess missionary spirit. And her career pretty much was that. One of the first things that she did when she got back was she worked on the Civil Air Program, defense program for the Spokane area. And this is a picture of some of the Spokanites putting together the civil defense program for the Spokane area. Next slide. In addition, one of the first things she did, she came back to Spokane like a ball on fire. One of the first things she did was work with Deaconess to develop their first emergency room department, and they built that on, and then immediately looked at that emergency room department and said, what are the things we need? And one of the first things she did was start a poison control program, because poisoned children was one of the first and prominent things that they saw in their emergency room. Burns, orthopedics, and poisoning. So she started a poison program. She also started a rural emergency program where they helicoptered children from the rural areas into the emergency room and put together the systems and the emergency processes that they needed as part of that civil defense and part of the emergency program for the entire area. And then put together a rural nurses association to coordinate and get all the nurses communicating so that they were all being trained correctly, including EMTs, on what they needed. Next slide. In addition, she was a very active member of the Nursing Association, so she continued to train not only EMTs and local rural nurses on the emergency practices, but she continued to work with all of the nursing programs that were throughout the Spokane area, especially the Deaconess School of Nursing, because it was still very active until the late 1980s. And so she became one of the senior nurses. During that time, the Red Cross recognized her with the Clara Barton Honor Award and the Ann Magnuson Award, the highest honors for volunteer nursing in the area, because she had taken not only the work she did there, but the Washington Emergency Nurses Association, the Rural Nurses Association, and now they give an annual Anna Mae Erickson Award in her name. To give you a little more, she not only developed the Poison Center, but then she went on to develop the Mr. Yuck program in the 1970s. And she saw the need and went on to advocate and develop the first rape kits in Spokane and train the police department on how to properly help rape victims and how to go through the process of helping them get evidence and go through the care that they needed when they presented at the hospital emergency room. Okay, next slide. This is Anna Mae. Do anyone know who the man is in the picture? Ron Baer. He was the mayor in the 70s. He was my bar client in 1978 when I was 21. And a cocktail waitress at the Davenport Hotel. He'd come in and get a drink. He was the mayor at the time. This is her having Ron Baer sign Mr. Yuck mention. And she became well known throughout the city. Next slide. So Anna Mae Erickson continued her career. She never did quite retire. She became the assistant director, supervisors of emergency outpatient departments, poison information centers, assistant directors and directors, and she went on to continue to work. She didn't retire till the late 1989, and by then I got to meet her and got to work with Anna Mae Erickson. She was quite an amazing lady. She was inducted into the Hall of Fame as one of the finest examples of humility, professionalism, compassion, humanitarianism, and volunteerism. And she is buried at the Greenwood Cemetery and has been honored too by our different people in Spokane as an example of selfless service throughout her life. And that gives you a little bit of picture about the power and the presence of this group of women that organized and saw. Not only do we have a Deaconess Hospital here in Spokane, as Dick mentioned, there's one also in Montana. There are 365 Deaconess Hospitals throughout the United States. And they were all faith-based nonprofits. Our hospital here locally became a for-profit in 1987, or they became a Washington State not-for-profit, and they eliminated their tie to the Methodist Church. That happened because of Medicare, it happened because of insurance, it happened because of the practices and the differences in how medical care is delivered today. Today, the Deaconess Hospital is owned by Multicare. Multicare happens to be a nonprofit that was started in the Seattle area and is also a nonprofit. But if you're interested in the Deaconess story, one of the best projects I ever got to work on was putting together that history. And if you go to the Deaconess Hospital on the 4th floor, you can see the entire history of the Deaconess Hospital and the Deaconess Hospital Nurses Association and all of the people that made a difference in Spokane for Deaconess. Susan. Last slide. There it is. Last slide.
Pam Reynolds, who is married to a police officer,
Yeah.
worked with her.
Yes.
And she came to the dedication of the historical monument, and which is up at the top of Greenwood. And she said, yeah, she came up to me, when she started this history in the hallways there, she came up to me and said, you will donate
Yes.
your time. And that was the kind of person she was. If she said you were going to do something, you just did it.
Yes.
And she told that story at the dedication. So she was a power.
She was a power to behold. And when Anna Mae asked for something, we all said yes.
Yeah.
And that's how she was. But in addition, she was a person who truly would never ask you for anything she wouldn't do herself. So those are the powerful women that I came to share today. I know you all know other powerful women that you know every single day. Pay attention, tell them thank you. Does anyone else have a powerful woman they need to share at this moment? If not, thank you for helping us share the powerful women that we found to share with you during History Minute.
Yes, Sue.
I want to add that I have an album over here on the table that shows pictures of the dedication of the historical monument to Mary Seymour, if you guys are curious about what they look like.
So they're right here, there's a photo album over here that you can go through that has pictures of Mary Seymour's
Historical monument.
historical monument, which is at Greenwood. on the first level there, the street level. Okay, anybody have any questions that we may have brought up tonight? Any thoughts? Anybody awake? Well, I don't know about you, but I thought this was kind of a fun night. And I certainly appreciate everybody that contributed to this to make this work. Thank you for all of you. And thank you for being an audience, because it's hard to have a speaker if you don't have an audience. So thank you, all of you.